Hi everyone! I'm Leslie Conzatti, fantasy author, book blogger, and proud resident of the Pacific Northwest. My publishing journey started about 4 years ago with a standalone fantasy retelling of The Little Mermaid, which I called Princess of Undersea. Since then, I've had a handful of short stories published in various anthologies. I also run a book blog called The Upstream Writer, where I post serial stories, reading lists, indie book reviews, future project plans, and a whole lot of writerly shenanigans. Currently, I'm in the process of actually relaunching Princess of Undersea as the first book in a series, which I'm calling The Undersea Saga.
When sitting down to visualize your world, what are the first things that you tend to see most clearly?
The first things I see when I'm inspired with an idea is usually what the characters are experiencing directly. Any smells, sights, sounds, textures, and emotions. Sometimes I'm experiencing the story in first person, through the eyes of the main character. Other times, it's more of an omniscient third-person perspective, like watching it play out on a movie set, seeing the characters going through the motions of a conversation or an interaction. A lot of time, it's one or two really significant scenes in the middle of the story, and then I have to go through the work of figuring out how the characters got there and what they're going to do next.
How do you like to introduce elements of your world? A narration explaining everything right up front, through unspoken actions sprinkled throughout, dialogue with your characters speaking to one another, or monologues where your character breaks the fourth wall, addressing your audience directly or talks to themselves, or a combo of these things, or something else entirely?
I like it best when I can introduce the world by immersing the reader into it. Whether through a combination of dialogue or a vivid description when there's a break in the action, the more I can bring the elements of the world to bear in subtle ways that are not all about, like, this is me telling you what the world looks like, but kind of a more natural thing, the better experience I think the reader will have.
When it comes to world building, what element do you feel is the most superfluous more times than not?
Hmm. One superfluous element that comes to mind is the penchant for creating new terminology for a cyberpunk or fantasy world, when really it looks and functions exactly like the familiar thing. For example, I remember being really excited to discover that a crime thriller author, whose books I loved for their character development and the really unique plot twists that keep you guessing, wrote a series of middle grade fantasy novels until I started reading it. The author opted to create new terms for normal things, like horses were called sleps, and then he had the term for dog was like whist, and the really confusing part was the what he called his people, like they weren't people, like they weren't humans. So ergo, you couldn't use terms like boy and girl and man and woman. It had to be like male this and female this and very young this. And it was just absolutely, it almost drove me crazy, but I stuck with it because the story was really good. Until book two. And it lasted until the end of book two. At the end of book two, the narrating character goes to what's supposed to be like the real world, where they use all like normal terms for things. And so then she had to unlearn all of the jargon that she'd grown up with. And here's the thing, from then on, for the rest of the series, she uses the normal terms. Like, she doesn't use any of the jargon. Like, the jargon was gone. And that just begs the question, then why do it in the first place? So, like, if you're going to have jargon, define it well and stick to it. Because sometimes that could be really fun. That could be part of the immersive experience. But at the end of the day, if it looks like a horse, it sounds like a horse, it eats like a horse, and you're going to use it like a horse, just call it a horse and just don't even bother.
Where do you feel most artists go wrong when it comes to world building?
So I might have answered this one a little bit in my last answer, but there's a couple other ways that come to mind. So, one way an artist can go wrong in their world building is if they aren't paying attention to what their story is actually communicating. I often say that writing is probably about as close to actual telepathy as humanity will get, because it's literally taking something that the artist pictures in their head and writing things down so that another person can have that same experience, can experience those same like mental pictures, can visualize the same thing. Now, that being said, if a writer isn't aware enough to represent their thoughts with just the right amount of detail, neither too much nor too little, then the experience is lost. Too much detail of the wrong sort, or too much given out all at once, is what's known as an info dump, and that tends to kill the momentum of the plot and lose the interest of the reader before the story is even finished. Not enough information can lead to the reader feeling lost, or run into the consequence of the author having to basically tell the reader how to feel about a certain scene or a certain character because they haven't provided the time to build that necessary emotional connection between the reader and the characters. The writer who kind of expects the reader to feel the same way they do about a certain subject hasn't really connected with their story, and that disconnect will definitely show through the writing, no matter how compelling the writer thinks they are. And the second way artists tend to go wrong in world building is when they follow the trope too closely. Now, I am a huge fan of fairy tale retellings, and fairy tales are full of tropes. But here's the thing. Tropes can be useful tools to get a certain point across. But if the artist doesn't bother to deviate in any way from the stereotype, the book just feels like a repetition of any other story that uses that particular trope. And if there's anything that spells the kiss of death for a book, as we all know, it's one that doesn't do anything to stand out among its peers. So, it's like, feel free to change it up when you're making a story, Use the trope as a launch point. Like most stories that start with a damsel in a tower would have you believe that she is somehow in distress. But what if she chooses the life of solitude? What if she likes being in the tower? How would that change the outcome? What kind of a conflict could that bring into the story, The smallest changes have the biggest impact in creating a completely unique story.
In thinking about your world expanding, is your approach to add things you've already created outside of the story you were telling, or creating something from scratch, brand new, to add into and build upon the world that already exists?
I recently had the opportunity to expand a fictional world as I transitioned Princes of Undersea from a standalone into the first in a series. And I kind of used both methods. So, like in that first book, there's some place names that I mentioned, or there's some references that I had to past events, kind of thing that kind of happened before the story, kind of a thing, and it didn't really come into play a lot in that first book. But going back and looking at it, I was able to see, hey, I could take this idea that I just kind of threw in there and I could expand on it, and it actually gave me more material to put into the sequels to kind of expand on this thing that I already had going. And so in that case, I added new characters to these places that I had already mentioned. So I have kind of more of an origin, kind of establishing it as a location. And so I kind of did both things. So I have new material coming in, but I also have fresh ideas coming out of things that I'd already put into the world, just kind of exploring those concepts a little deeper. And, it's nice to create fresh new solutions to plot snarls and problems that you have. But it's also fun to kind of find out that this thing that I had just threw in on a whim actually makes the stories even stronger as I go through the sequels. Well, this concludes my interview. Thanks to Joe and GoIndieNow for hosting. You can find listings of my books and anthologies sold on Amazon via my author profile, amazon.com/author/Leslie Conzatti. You can keep updated on book sales, giveaway events, and everything else I'm writing or reading on my Facebook page, Leslie Conzatti, the Upstream Writer. I post book reviews, serials, and current projects on my blog, upstreamwriter.blogspot.com. Hope to see you there.